This is the Ben Shapiro Show. Joining us online is Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. Senator Paul, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks for having me.
So why don't we start with the current controversy over vaccine mandates and mask mandates. Obviously, President Biden today is slated to talk about how he is going to cram down vaccine mandates nearly everywhere. It is incredible to me that I'm a big advocate of the vaccines. I'm also an advocate of natural immunity. The notion that the federal government ought to be cramming down vaccine mandates at a time when every single adult has had the ability to get the vaccine, and once you have the vaccine or once you have natural immunity, you're pretty well protected from COVID. It's really insane.
Any vaccine mandate that ignores natural immunity is ignoring the science. You know, vaccines are based on natural immunity. We learned over time that when you get an infection with a bacteria or a virus, your body responded to kill the invader, but also to have a memory to kill the invader if the invader comes back. And so what we have is about 40 million Americans have had COVID. Antibody testing or surveys showed that about 80 million more had it and didn't know it. So we're about at 120 million people. And it's really such a disservice to people who got it and survived. Think of all the hospital workers who risked their lives to take care of people when there wasn't a vaccine, got COVID, survived. And now the hospitals are saying, oh, we don't care that you risked your life to save patients with COVID. We don't care about your natural immunity. You have to be vaccinated. And it's so much about submission, but it's not about the science at all. And if you look and compare natural immunity, and I'm for the vaccine also, I think the vaccine is advisable, particularly for high-risk people. But the thing is, if you look at the statistics coming out of Israel, that those who have been vaccinated versus those who had previous infection, the previous infection is significantly better protective right now. What's happening is the Delta variant is escaping some of the vaccines. Vaccine's still advisable, but the naturally infected is showing even better protection against reinfection. So I think that really any kind of mandate that ignores natural immunity is a huge mistake and unscientific.
Senator Paul, one of the big questions that's arisen and has been used by the media so much is this vaccine hesitancy on the part of many Republicans and many people generally across the United States. And as somebody who is an advocate of the vaccine, when people ask me about this, my quick answer is our public institutions have utterly failed us. Our supposed public health experts have been lying to us every single step of the way. Obviously, you've had a bunch of much ballyhooed confrontations with Dr. Anthony Fauci, the patron saint of the public health establishment, a man who has declared himself the science. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the role of our institutional actors in undermining trust in the actual science.
Yeah, and I've repeatedly said to Dr. Fauci to his face that he's the one undermining and creating vaccine hesitancy. When you lie to people and then you admit that you lied and you say, well, it's a noble lie, it's a platonic lie. I lied to the people because the people aren't able to handle the truth. And I thought by lying to them, I'd get them to do better behavior. I think then people become very distrustful of the messenger. And from the very beginning, whether it's the origin of the virus coming from the lab, which he quickly covered up with meetings all night long, emails all night long to cover it up on January 31st as the news came forward that this could have come from the lab, or whether it's the masks that he initially told the truth and said that most of the cloth masks don't work and that masks in a public setting generally don't seem to change the tide of the disease. In fact, if we look at the mask mandates all throughout, every time they've been instituted by government, there's been no correlation with a reduction in incidence of the disease. In fact, the disease has gone through the roof. The incidence has gone through the roof in a proportional way to the mandates. So really, most of the things that Dr. Fauci has said have not been completely honest or accurate. And because of that, so many people doubt all of the things. And there's some people who doubt the vaccine now because of the dishonesty and the previous dishonesty of Dr. Fauci.
So, Senator Paul, one of the things that you had a pretty interesting tete-a-tete with Dr. Fauci about was gain-of-function research. He seems to be hiding behind the definition of gain-of-function research as opposed to simply the reality, which is that he was in charge of the NIH at a time when there was funding being routed to the Wuhan Institute of Virology to perform what would colloquially be called gain-of-function research. I mean, it was adding a human function to an animal virus. He says that doesn't count as gain-of-function research, so he's off scot-free, but that doesn't change the underlying facts of what actually was funded.
Well, he's actually never been forced to explain why it's not gain-of-function research. When he gets on an interview, it's usually with one of the mainstream outlets, and they yuck it up, and they laugh, and they chuckle, and they chortle about, oh, conspiracy theory this, conspiracy theory that. but no one's ever asking why it isn't gain of function. What they did in the Wuhan lab and what he aided in funding, which he continues to support the funding, by the way, the recent documents from The Intercept say that the funding goes on from 2020 to 2025. So they're still funding it. They haven't learned any lesson. But in those studies that they're doing, they take the SARS virus, which was the coronavirus from 2004, with a 15% mortality. They take the genes from that and they merge it with the genes for the S protein on different coronaviruses they find in the cave that are unknown how dangerous they are. They merge them and see if they can infect humanized cells. Well, it turns out, one of the papers, they had 8 unknown viruses from a bat cave in southern China. 2 of them they found out were more transmissible after they merged these genes and created a virus that is not known in nature. Well, that's the definition of gain of function. I mean, someone needs to ask him some tough questions. Why is that not gain of function when you take 2 different viruses, you recombine them, you create a new virus never known to man, never existed in nature, and you find out it infects human cells? Isn't that gain of function? So he's hiding behind it on technicalities, but no one's even forced him to explain why it's not gain of function.
So, Senator Paul, all of this seems part and parcel of a broader attempt by the government to make a promise they just can't keep, which is if you just listen to us, if you just surrender all of your liberties, then we will protect you from death and we will protect you forever. And this is part and parcel of a broader agenda for the Democratic Party, which is sort of cradle to grave. We will take care of you. We are your parent. At the same exact time that Democrats are purposefully locking down the economy in broad swaths of the United States, based again on the lie that people can't get the vaccine for some odd reason. Every single adult has had the chance to get the vaccine in the United States. If people choose not to get that vaccine, that is their choice and that is their problem. Instead, the Democrats are simultaneously suppressing the economy and then claiming that because of the suppression of the economy, we definitely have to spend $3.5 trillion to create cradle-to-grave welfare benefit schemes.
And I fully believe that people are losing their lives every day because we put all of our eggs in one basket. And I'm not anti-vaccine, but people need to realize, and people do know this, that people have been previously infected and people who have been vaccinated are getting this Delta variant, and some are dying. There is a treatment out there, and this is where Governor DeSantis comes in and has done a great job in making sure people know about the treatment. In the last week, I've helped 2 people that I know, to get the IV monoclonal antibodies by calling their doctor, calling the hospital. But it took a great deal of intervention between me and their family advocating for the monoclonal antibodies to get them. Both of them fortunately got better. Now, that's not a scientific experiment, but when you look at the experiments in a controlled study, 85% reduction in hospitalization and death with the monoclonal antibodies. But have you ever heard Dr. Fauci in one of his 20 different appearances on TV daily mention the monoclonal antibodies? No, he's talking about vaccines and masks and things like that, which is all good and well. But if you get it, 80% of people getting it are wearing a mask. So the mask isn't much good after you've already got it. Now what you need to do is figure out how to survive. But there's a window of time. The monoclonal antibodies, they will not give them to you if you're too sick. If you're too well, they won't either. So there's this window right in the middle where you're eligible for them based on your age and the severity of your symptoms. But I promise you, in America right now, there's not enough awareness of this. And people need to be all over television saying, you want to save your loved one's life. You need to be aware there is a treatment, but you can't wait too long. You have to get to the doctor soon enough to get the treatment.
Senator Paul, that also raises the fact that Dr. Fauci has been, I would say, obscuring the facts about masking itself. I mean, number one, he suggested that vaccinated people needed to mask even when earlier in the pandemic they absolutely did not. And now he has suggested that it doesn't matter what kind of mask you wear, which obviously is untrue according to the studies. Cloth face masks do very little with regard to Delta, according to some of Biden's own advisors.
Think about it this way, too. He's actually giving you advice that could get you killed. So let's say you're 80 years old and your spouse has COVID and you're going to be around them on a daily basis, giving them food in the same room, helping them out because they're your spouse. Well, guess what? If you wear a cloth mask, you're putting yourself at risk for getting COVID. The N95 does work if worn properly. It's not perfect, but works a lot better. It has to have a tight seal. It has to be discarded. You can't touch it. You'd have to have a stack of them. But the N95 is what they wear in the hospital. Nobody wears cut up pieces of your undergarments for masks in the hospital. They don't work. The studies say they don't work. But if you say that on YouTube, you get kicked off YouTube. I've been kicked off YouTube. Big tech has been slapping my hands for telling the truth. Unless you're a Biden advisor who said the same thing, this Osterholm, who didn't get warned at all by big tech. But the bottom line is this. they are endangering your life by giving you bad advice. I remember on CNN, the so-called doctors on CNN, they were saying that a mask is more important than a vaccine. Well, that's just absolute television malpractice, because the mask is not more important than the vaccine. The vaccine might save your life. IV monoclonals might save your life. Steroids might save your life, but in no way is the mask going to save your life.
Well, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky, appreciate you standing strong on these issues and appreciate your time, sir.
Thanks, man.
Joining us on the line is Josh Mandel, Marine Corps veteran who served 2 tours in Anbar Province, Iraq, and served 2 terms in the Ohio legislature, as well as 2 terms as state treasurer of Ohio. Josh is currently a candidate for U.S. Senate in Ohio. All of the current polls have him ahead in the primaries. Josh, thanks so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Ben. Good to be on.
So let's talk about the state of the Ohio Senate race on a broad level, and then we'll get to the actual details of the primary. So on a broad level, obviously, this race matters an awful lot. The Republican control of the Senate is up for grabs. I would have said that it was a fairly even shot, Republicans grabbing the Senate up until the last several weeks. And now it appears that Republicans are in pretty good shape to retake the Senate, considering the races in New Hampshire and Nevada, but Republicans must hold Ohio. So the polls consistently show that almost no matter who the Republican candidate is, that against somebody like Tim Ryan, it's very close in Ohio. How close do you think the race is for that seat next year?
Listen, this is a state where President Trump won twice. He won by about 500,000 votes both times. And so I believe over the past few elections, we've probably ventured from being a purple state to being a Trump state. But that doesn't mean that we're bright red. We're definitely not Alabama or Texas. We're a state that, is still split politically. But what's changed is the Democrat Party left Democrats. And President Trump spoke to so many men and women in this state who, for a living, swing hammers and bend steel and run wire and drive trucks. Right now I'm coming at you from a town called Columbus Grove, Ohio. It's nowhere near Columbus. I'm in rural Western Ohio. And, people in this part of the state are the embodiment of red-blooded, patriotic Americans. And even if there's folks not too far from here in places like Toledo that might have been Union Democrats, now they're Trump Republicans. So in my mind, Ben, this election, it's not just about nominating a Republican. It's about nominating the right kind of Republican. We have to nominate, not just here in Ohio, but across the country, constitutional conservatives who are willing to take on the squishy rhino establishment Republicans.
So, Josh, obviously you're running in a primary. The typical rule says you run to the right during a primary and then to the center during a general. You've received a lot of criticism, particularly online, for sort of the criticism is a Trumpy affect, right? Burning a mask, tweeting in pretty, I would say, colorful ways. What do you make of those criticisms?
I am who I am. I've never changed. When I was state treasurer, I was the Republican who was leading the charge against John Kasich when he was the Republican governor. And when Kasich was trying to expand Medicaid under Obamacare, I led the charge against Medicaid expansion. And a lot of folks in the Republican Party were like, hey, Josh, you can't do this. He's a Republican governor. I said, listen, I don't care if he's a Republican or a Democrat. Expanding Medicaid and making people more dependent on welfare is the wrong thing. Then when Kasich was trying to push forward Common Core, the federal education standards, I said, wait a second. We don't want Washington, D.C. involved with education here in Ohio. And so I led the charge against Kasich on that. When Kasich was trying to keep the state's finances and state spending in the dark from the taxpayers, I took the state of Ohio's checkbook. I put that on the internet. I said the taxpayers have a right to know how the tax money is being spent. And so, listen, it's not lost on me that there's a lot of folks who are sort of the more establishment part of the Republican Party that don't like me, but I wear that as a badge of honor. And it's not new to me to be taking on these squishy establishment Republicans. I've been doing it for a long time. I did it when Kasich was the governor of Ohio. I've been calling out Mike DeWine, recently. Mike DeWine has acted like a total tyrant during COVID. I've been calling him out as well, and he's a Republican governor. And listen, I'm not in politics, Ben, to make friends. I'm not going to Washington to make friends or to get invited to cocktail parties. I'm going there to stand up for the Constitution and to stand up for the liberty and the freedom of individuals here in Ohio and throughout the country.
So, Josh, obviously you're in a very hotly fought primary campaign. Right now, one of the other candidates who's been getting a lot of online attention, less attention in the polling so far, is J.D. Vance. He has been gaining in the polling. Originally, he was in the single digits. You're still doubling him up in some of the new polling. You're in the 30s, and he's still in the teens. But what do you make of some of your opposition in the primary? And maybe you can do a bit of a comparison as to why you'd make the best candidate from Ohio.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if the election were held today in Hollywood, Silicon Valley, Wall Street, or DC, I think J.D. Vance would run away with it. But if the election was held today in Ohio, he'd get destroyed because Ohioans are not buying what he's selling. When President Trump was running against Hillary Clinton, J.D. Vance said that he was going to hold his nose and possibly vote for Hillary Clinton. Instead, he voted for Evan McMuffin, but he couldn't bring himself to vote for Donald Trump. Then, when Hillary Clinton and the Democrat Party were calling all of us deplorable, J.D. Vance was out there calling us racists. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, man. I mean, he was literally going around the country trying to sell a book, calling people back in his home state of Ohio racist for supporting Donald Trump. And so here in Ohio, the voters know that. They see him as a total phony and a total fraud. One of the other people running against me, Jane Timken, she defended the impeachment against Donald Trump. She called it rational. She was asked how she would vote on it. She said she didn't know. And listen, the reality is I was the first statewide official in Ohio to support President Trump. I believe in his America First policies. I will be an America First Senate candidate. And it's one of the reasons I'm up big in the polls. But let me tell you the other reason I'm up big in the polls here. We are not running this campaign through traditional Republican Party groups. All the people running against me, they're running their campaigns through the Republican Party. I'm doing something different. I am running my campaign through churches. This has never been done before in the state of Ohio. We were at a church called Victory and Truth Ministries in the middle of a soybean field in rural Crawford County, Ohio. Then we had 250 people there. We were down in Findlay, Ohio at First Nazarene, 270 people there. We were at a church called Solid Rock Church in Lebanon, Ohio, halfway between Dayton and Cincinnati, 500 people there. And then last week, we had a rally at a church called Community Grace Brethren Church in West Milton, Ohio. It's a church literally in the middle of a cornfield. We had over 600 patriots show up. And so while my opponents, draw crowds of 14 people here and 17 people there, we've got 400, 500, 600 people coming out to our events. And a lot of these people, Ben, they've never in their life been to a political event, but they see what's going on with our country. They're watching Biden take our country down. They're watching the schools trying to indoctrinate our kids. And they look at me as the one person who will fight to take on these very powerful moneyed forces to stand up for our kids and stand up for our country and stand up for our Constitution.
So, Josh, final question for you. Obviously, we've all been watching the Afghanistan debacle and Joe Biden's behavior during it. It is pretty astonishing that the United States cut and ran from Afghanistan for no apparent reason at all. As a veteran of the Iraq War, what do you make of the moves made here by the Biden administration?
Sure. I believe that Joe Biden is mentally and physically unfit to be the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military. I believe he should resign or be impeached. I believe some of his decisions in this Afghanistan debacle have been some of the worst decisions, not just in my lifetime, but some of the worst decisions by a commander-in-chief of the military in the history of the United States of America, starting with his decision to voluntarily abandon Bagram Air Base. It doesn't take a military expert to know that ingress, egress through airfields is ever important when you're trying to get American civilians, American troops, American military equipment out of a country. And the fact that he voluntarily shut it down and abandoned it will go down as one of the worst decisions in U.S. military history. Then he and his woke generals decided that it was a good idea somehow to put American citizens, the civilians, last in line to be evacuated from the country. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. First, you bring out the American civilians, the American citizens, then American military equipment and American military technology, then U.S. troops. And upon bringing the U.S. troops out, you can bring some of the local allies out as well. But they botched this every single step of the way. And I think we got to ask the question, over the past 8 months of his presidency, if Biden and General Milley and Secretary Austin, if they weren't so focused on wokeness And instead, if they were focused on war fighting and this withdrawal from Afghanistan, would we have lost lives here? And I think the answer is no. The blood of these Marines, the soldier, and the U.S. Navy corpsman medic, who actually grew up not too far from where I'm sitting right now in Columbus Grove, Ohio, their blood is on Joe Biden's hands. And that's why I believe Joe Biden should be impeached.
And Josh Mandel, he is running for that Ohio Senate seat. And obviously, good luck to you, Josh. How can people help out your campaign?
They can go to my website. It's joshmandel.com, JOSHMANDEL.com. You can go on there to donate. You can volunteer. You don't have to live in Ohio to donate. You don't have to live in Ohio to volunteer. This race will be one of the most important races in the country. And as I mentioned earlier, it's not just about taking back the U.S. Senate. It's not just about combating the radical left and the secular left. My campaign is also about a fight for the soul of the Republican Party. And we don't want any more Romneys. We don't want any more Liz Cheneys. We want to elect people like me, Josh Mandel, to be reinforcements in Washington to fighters like Jim Jordan, Ted Cruz, and Donald Trump.
Alrighty, we've reached the end of today's show, but we have much more coming tomorrow, including Joe Biden. A little more of your liberty will go a long way. According to Joe Biden, this is the Ben Shapiro Show.